Let me begin by introducing you to the book of Genesis. The title of the book, Genesis, comes from the opening word in the beginning, which in Greek is genesios. In ancient times, books were often named after their first word or two. And Genesis is a carefully crafted book through which the writer, largely attributed to Moses, draws you into God's story. In the beginning, God. And Genesis falls into two parts. Chapters 1 to 11, usually described as prehistory, and chapters 11 to 50, which are usually described as patriarchal history. Each part divides into 5 sections, each starting with the equivalent phrase, "These are the generations of." I have to say it again, Genesis is a carefully crafted book. Genesis introduces us to 3 of the great themes of the Bible, 3 of the chapters we were talking about last week. And these themes will be repeated through the story that God tells from Genesis to Revelation. We are introduced to the Creator God, the tragedy of the fall of man and God's plan for redemption. Genesis is first and foremost a book of theology. I'll state this clearly at the beginning because it needs to be said, Genesis is a book of theology. Using the word history to describe the 2 parts of Genesis is a little problematic because we all have a certain idea of what history means. We expect it to be a historical account in the way our modern minds read history. Genesis, and the writer in particular, uses exalted prose rather than narrative prose. Narrative prose being a linear, step-by-step progression that we would normally expect if we were reading history. He uses exalted prose. For example, Cain is condemned to be a wanderer, Nad, in the land of wanderings, Nod, a wanderer in the land of wanderings. You'll remember that. Both words have the same root in the original language, and the power of the storytelling is lost in our translation. How do you write an account of prehistory events that have no time-conditioned, human-conditioned, or experience-based historical references to draw from? It's the same problem John has in writing Revelation. You have to use analogy. So the writer uses what was known in the day. Circulating at the time were creation accounts, flood narratives, Tower of Babel stories of how God interacted with man. You may have heard people denounce the Genesis account because of the similarities with Mesopotamian literature. That misses the point altogether. What's important is not the similarities or the vehicles used to tell the story, but the differences. What does it tell us about God? Genesis is seeking to answer the question about who is this God who brought the people up out of Egypt and is meeting their needs while wandering around in the desert. Genesis is a book of theology. Genesis is first and foremost a book of theology. This becomes even more important when some want to read the creation narrative and flood narratives as historical events through scientific eyes. Genesis gives a true account of the origin of the material universe, but does not provide information in a way that corresponds to the purposes of modern science. Kind does not correspond to species. Day does not mean an exact chronological length of time, and the flood covering the earth has less to do with global impact and more to do with the catastrophic and widespread nature of those that experienced it. If we read Genesis with historical or scientific eyes, not that we're denying any of these events happened, we do Genesis a disservice. Genesis is first and foremost a carefully crafted book of theology, introducing us to who God is. And this is the exciting thing we must turn our attention to now. And I want to highlight the 4 C's of Genesis: creation, catastrophe, choosing, and covenant. The first thing I want to begin with is the story of creation. The point of Genesis 1 is to introduce us to the Creator God. Genesis is telling us the story of creation against a backdrop of people believing that everything was created at the whim of capricious gods who inhabited things like the sun and the moon and the stars, and human beings were no more than slaves to their desires. No, says Genesis. And the central refrain throughout the opening chapter is that God created and it was good. A good God creates a good world, and the apex of that good creation is humanity. Genesis challenges the philosophies of the day with the truth that a good God created a good world. This was important to the original readers because this deeply challenged what was believed in the day. It was important at the time of Jesus, when the Greeks had exalted human reason and removed God from the picture. It's important for us now, when evolution is so exalted that we're merely the product of our genetic material. No, there is a good God, and all things were created by him. His omnipotent nature means that he merely needs to speak, and a creative stream comes forth from his mouth and brings forth life. The first chapter we read God created, and the second chapter we read God formed. This is a picture of being intimately involved in the creation process. God gets his hands dirty. It's word and deed that brings forth life. It's an outpouring of the love God has for his creation. Nothing capricious, nothing ad hoc. This is God's loving and good intent for the world. A good God loves the world so much that he's intimately and joyfully involved in its creation. The apex of this creative process is people, and this is seen in verse 27 with a threefold use of the word created. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. It conveys a dignity and worth to human beings that countered the view that people were just slaves to the whims of the gods. No, says Genesis. God, the good God, creates people to be in relationship with him. They occupy a unique place within creation. This dignity, this value, this divine relationships impacts how we treat others. From the unborn child made in God's image, to our immediate neighbor, to the person we find most challenging. Genesis sets out the worth of human life because God creates them to have worth, and God does not make mistakes. As Creator God, he imparts his divine image to men and women to rule the earth in God's name. The context of creation was good, and dominion is to be a good thing. Good dominion reveals to the watching world the glory of God. Such a purpose was possible because we lived in relationship with God, not as slaves or servants, but friends who co-labored with God. Genesis counters the culture of the day that reduced people to worthless minions. Rather, it conveys on each person a glorious purpose in creation. Genesis begins with such magnificent vistas of all that God intended when he created the world. But the second thing I want to look at is catastrophe. The goodness, the dignity, the purpose, such magnificent themes. Yet the story quickly changes. Genesis 2 is not a second creative narrative. It's the prelude to Genesis 3 and the catastrophe of the fall. As the potter molds the earth and breathes life into the creature, we're reminded of how frail and utterly dependent on God we are for every breath. Yet, we still rebelled. We had a position of incredible privilege, and our rebellion is ridiculous, and the result catastrophic. It's often as we grow older that we become increasingly aware of the consequences. We said last week that one of the consequences of the fall is that we lost the divine presence. This losing of the divine presence means we now face life on our own. We wrestle with the cataclysmic events of life that blight us. We struggle to comprehend man's inhumanity to man. We're grieved by the duplicity of our own life, and we have to stare the ultimate spectre in the face, death itself. In the tragedy of life, how can we reconcile our experience to the goodness of God and his reported love of us? Genesis turns next to describe what happened. The first people reached out and usurped the divine prerogative over their life. They believed the lie that God was holding out on them. They doubted his goodness, and so they seized at the deception that they could become like God. In that moment of self-realization, they knew what they'd done and they hid from God. And people have been hiding from God ever since. The primal unity of community is broken, and husband and wife drive a wedge between them as they play the blame game. It's a salutary reminder that if anything usurps God's preeminence in our lives, it will only lead to catastrophe. That's why, looking forward, the first command God gives his people is make him number one in their lives. You shall have no other gods before me. Yet Genesis does not believe that we will grasp the catastrophe that has befallen us. So it piles story upon story to describe the radical nature and seriousness of sin. In Genesis 4, Cain kills Abel. It's followed by the Song of Lamech as he sings, glorifying the violence of vengeance, and he encourages his two wives to rejoice with him. Though Genesis 6, 1-4 is very hard to interpret, the depravity of humanity has become such that the boundaries between the divine and human worlds have become so broken that demonic powers are at loose and humanity cannot control what is going on. It's a picture of ever-decreasing circles, sin piled upon sin. So God starts again with Noah. And we can hear ourselves saying, why doesn't God start with a righteous man? And he does. But the spiral of depravity continues after Noah. The arrogance of humanity ends with the story of the Tower of Babel, where people say, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we might make a name for ourselves. Prehistory ends in a place of hopelessness and despair because there's nothing people can do to halt their or society's depravity. It's a salutary reminder and challenge as how seriously we see sin. Any sin, all sin, is utterly catastrophic. Genesis tells the story of man's struggle with sin. But that's not the end of the catastrophe. We cannot learn a better way of living. We cannot buy some self-help books from Waterstones and recover from the effects of sin. Genesis is candid. God, as a good God, has to judge sin, and we are condemned. God's judgment is found in the garden, on the woman, on the man, on the serpent. And though the writer hints that there is a day when victory will overturn everything, it's a catastrophe that people who once lived in relationship with God now live with his judgment. We love the story of Noah, yet we've lost the awesome power and terror of the story. The cataclysmic destruction of the flood brings home horrifically God's right to judge and how terrible that judgment is for those who fall into the hands of a good and righteous God. At Babel, God confronts and judges not just the sin of the individual, but corporate affairs of community. All of society falls under the judgment of God. No one and nothing escapes. In this age of highly excitable language, catastrophe can sound like another exaggeration, but Genesis seeks to convey the catastrophic nature of sin and judgment. As we read this section of Genesis, we could be forgiven for becoming really rather depressed. But the third thing I want to look at is God chooses. Genesis offers hope. God is not only just, but is also gracious. From Genesis 3:15, he will crush your head and you will strike his heel, to Noah saved through the flood, we're given this hope that God encounters our unfaithfulness with his graciousness. God's story of hope and grace begins as he chooses Abraham to begin to address the catastrophe sin has had on human beings and our relationship with God. The story of God's choosing begins with God choosing. Genesis wants to make this clear. Choosing always begins with God. Abraham's forefathers were polytheists. They worshipped many gods. But here, Abraham is chosen to leave that all behind and enter into a relationship with the one true God. Each patriarch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, are all invited to worship the single God and enter into personal relationship with him. This is in stark contrast to the surrounding people of the day, the Canaanites, who thought their gods were located in particular places. Here, Genesis reveals God to be a relational being, a personal God. And Genesis stresses what matters to God is relationships, not ceremonies. Perhaps we see this most graphically as Abraham pleads for Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 18. We see two friends talking, God revealing his heart and Abraham asking him to change his mind. It's a beautiful picture of the nature of a faithful relationship with God. God makes himself vulnerable to the ones he chooses. Genesis also reveals how unexpected that calling is. God often chooses the weaker or the most unlikely. He bypasses the firstborn, the convention of the day, and chooses Seth over Cain, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau. He chooses barren women, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, to bear a great nation. God chooses the obscure. Abraham lives trapped between the great empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia. It's a backwater place, but out of this insignificant place, God reveals himself and chooses a man to follow him. As we read through the story of the patriarchs, we're aware of how ordinary and sinful they are. The text does not cover up their flaws. Abraham tries to pass his wife off as his sister to save his skin, not once, but twice. Jacob is a grasper from birth, and his tussle with Laban, which he spends considerable years trying to get the better of him, reveals his grasping nature. He and Laban are two scheming men going head to head. It's not until Jacob meets with God and wrestles with him that he finally meets his match and stops trying to seize things in his own strength. God does not choose people because of their goodness. God chooses obscure people from obscure places who have dubious backgrounds and characters to enter into relationship with him. This is all the assurance that we need, that we are chosen. As Peter sums it up, once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. And we humbly acknowledge that our hope is in God's choosing. That choosing is supremely met in the covenant relationship God enters into with those he chooses. And so the fourth thing we want to look at is covenant. It begins with Noah, of which we're reminded each time we see a rainbow, but finds its defining role within the relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The story is not so much about Abraham, but about God. He begins by promising. He chooses and he covenants himself to enter into relationship with the other person. A covenant is a relationship or an agreement that did not and could not exist by normal means. People could not have a relationship with God, but God covenants himself in a promised commitment to those he has chosen. He promises people land, blessing, and requires nothing in return. It's God that condescends to enter into a relationship with man. It's God who makes himself vulnerable to the one he loves. A covenant commitment means that God takes the first risk and makes himself vulnerable to people. He's hoping that they in turn will respond to his covenant commitment and receive by faith the promises that he has made. It requires a step of faith. Abraham is asked to leave his country, all that he's familiar with, and go on a journey with God. He receives the promise of God, but he receives them into a situation where it appears hopeless. How can he be a mighty nation when his wife is childless? How can he occupy the land when he's a nameless wanderer? How can the land he is promised belong to him when it's occupied by others? It's a walk of faith because there is a need for human responsibility, but there's also a need to allow God to be God and surprise us by his presence. Abraham walks by faith. And in contrast, Sarah tries to make the promise come to pass. She gives Abraham, her servant, such a bad idea. In contrast, Abraham takes what appears to be the promised fulfillment, namely Isaac, and prepares to take his life in order to live in obedience to God. It's this faith that God seeks in covenant relationship with his people. Abraham becomes a model to us all as to how we are to walk in covenant faith with a good God who chooses us despite our sinfulness. Let's just pause for a moment as we've been through the book of Genesis and just allow the Spirit to touch us and bring to mind the one thing. Let's just pause there for a moment. We've had an overview of Genesis. Let's allow the Holy Spirit to speak to us and highlight especially what he wants us to take away from this overview.